Ethan Collins had always believed that control was his greatest asset. Control over his empire, his reputation, and most importantly, his emotions. But tonight, as he wandered aimlessly through the abandoned park, he realized just how fragile that control had become. His footsteps echoed against the cracked pavement, each one a reminder of how far he had fallen from the man he thought he was. The chill of the autumn wind cut through his designer suit, yet he barely noticed. Something far colder gnawed at him from the inside. His mind raced, tangled in the mess of his personal life. Megan, his wife of 3 years, had become a stranger to him. Once his greatest ally, she now felt like an adversary in his own home. Their arguments had become frequent, toxic even, over things Ethan could no longer ignore: their future, their happiness, the family they never started. Her words still echoed in his mind from the fight earlier that evening. "You're obsessed with your work. You don't even see what's happening around you. It's like you're already gone, Ethan." And maybe she was right. Maybe he was losing himself. He had built an empire, sure, his name was synonymous with power and wealth, but at what cost? The pressure to maintain the facade of perfection, to be the man everyone expected him to be, had left him hollow. Tonight, that emptiness felt unbearable. Lost in these thoughts, he didn't notice the faint sound at first. A baby crying. It was distant, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable. Ethan stopped abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. It was so out of place in the quiet stillness of the park that it almost felt surreal. He scanned the shadows, his pulse quickening. Who would leave a baby here, of all places? He followed the sound, stepping off the path and into the darker, overgrown area of the park. His senses heightened, adrenaline coursing through him as he approached a weathered bench. Underneath a flickering street lamp, he saw her, an emaciated woman, cradling a small bundle tightly to her chest. Her clothes were ragged, stained from what looked like weeks, maybe months, of living on the streets. But it was the baby in her arms that caught his attention. The crying had subsided to soft whimpers, but as Ethan drew closer, he could see the tiny hand poking out from under the makeshift blanket. A hand with a small, crescent-shaped birthmark on the wrist. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the mark, his brain struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. That mark, it was impossible, but there it was. The same exact birthmark he had on his own wrist. His parents had always told him it was a family trait, something passed down through generations. But what were the odds? How could this baby, a stranger, have the same unique mark? The woman looked up then, her hollow eyes meeting his. She clutched the baby tighter, as if sensing the connection Ethan had just made. Her face, once emotionless, contorted in fear and desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaky and broken. "Don't come any closer." But Ethan couldn't stop. He knelt down in front of her, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his ears. Who is this child?" His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. He was too overwhelmed to maintain the usual calm, controlled tone that he was known for. "Where did you get him?" The woman, still trembling, averted her eyes and shook her head. I can't." Ethan's chest tightened, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You can't what? Who are you? And how does this baby," he gestured to the mark on the child's wrist, "have this?" His own hand instinctively moved to reveal the birthmark on his wrist. The sight of it, the undeniable proof, made him feel as if the ground was slipping from under him. The woman began to cry, soft at first, but soon she was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching the child even closer to her chest. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to. They made me." They said they would. Her words dissolved into incoherent gasps, as if the weight of whatever secret she carried was too much for her to bear. Ethan's mind was spinning. Who made her do what? Who was she talking about? He tried to slow his breathing, tried to regain some semblance of control over the situation, but it was slipping further out of his grasp by the second. His gaze darted back to the baby, now fast asleep despite the woman's anguish. The little boy looked so peaceful, so innocent. Ethan felt an inexplicable pull toward the child, a connection that went beyond the birthmark. "I need you to tell me the truth," Ethan demanded, though his voice had softened. He was no longer the commanding businessman, but a man desperate for answers, for clarity in the storm of confusion swirling around him. "Who are you? Who made you take this child?" The woman wiped at her tears with a shaky hand, her eyes bloodshot and swollen. "My name is Rosa," she muttered, voice cracking. "I didn't mean to hurt him. I swear. But they told me to take him. They said it would be better for everyone if he just disappeared." "Who told you that?" Ethan's voice was laced with urgency. He needed answers now, needed to understand the full picture before it drove him mad. Rosa shook her head, eyes wide with fear, as though she couldn't speak the name out loud. "I can't. If I tell you, they'll come for me. And for him." Ethan felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. The baby, could he really be? No. It was impossible. But something deep inside him was stirring, a gut feeling he couldn't ignore. "I'll protect you," Ethan promised, though he wasn't sure how he could. "But I need to know. Is this my son?" The words felt foreign on his tongue, but the moment he said them, everything seemed to fall into place. Rosa's sobs grew quieter, and her gaze finally met his. In that moment, he knew, before she could even say it, that the answer was yes. Ethan sat at the edge of his bed, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. The clock on the wall ticked in rhythm with his racing heartbeat, though it offered no solace. Just hours ago, his life had been turned upside down by a child in a park and the strange confession of a desperate woman. His thoughts kept returning to the moment when Rosa had confirmed his worst fear: the baby was his son. But how? He hadn't spoken to Claire, his ex, in years. They'd parted ways on bad terms, tangled in the tension between his family's expectations and her desire for a simpler life. Had she been pregnant when they broke up? Did she try to tell him? No, that couldn't be. Claire wasn't the type to keep something like that a secret. Yet here he was, grappling with the fact that somewhere along the line, he had fathered a child he never knew existed, and that someone had gone to great lengths to keep him from finding out. His phone vibrated on the nightstand, pulling him out of his thoughts. Megan's name flashed across the screen. He hesitated, then let the call go to voicemail. His stomach churned at the thought of facing her. After their argument earlier, after everything he'd discovered, he couldn't bring himself to pretend that things were normal. Nothing about this situation was normal. But Megan's growing distance and evasiveness nagged at him, too. Something was off, even before all this. She was hiding something, but what? Shaking the thoughts from his mind, Ethan stood up and crossed the room to the large window overlooking the city. The light stretched far into the distance, twinkling like 1,000 promises of success. His success. The empire he had built brick by brick, deal by deal. But for the first time, those lights felt hollow. Everything he had worked for, everything he'd sacrificed, now seemed insignificant compared to the little boy whose face haunted him. Determined, Ethan grabbed his jacket and headed out. He needed answers. If Rosa wasn't willing to tell him who had forced her to take the child, there was only one other person who could: the woman he once loved. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe. Ethan's car sped down the darkened streets, headlights illuminating the path ahead. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and he tried to ignore the anxiety twisting in his gut. It had been so long since he'd seen Claire. What would she think when he showed up unannounced? More importantly, what would she say when he asked about the child? The last time they spoke had been volatile. Claire had been so certain that their lives were moving in opposite directions: he, the rising star in the corporate world, and she, a free spirit craving a life of peace and simplicity. Their breakup had been final, clean, but filled with unresolved tension. As the city blurred past him, Ethan realized he hadn't just distanced himself from Claire. He had distanced himself from everything that made him human. Soon, he pulled up to the modest townhouse where Claire had moved after they split. It looked the same as he remembered, warm, inviting, and a stark contrast to his cold, modern penthouse. With a deep breath, he walked up to the door, his heart pounding. He raised his fist to knock but hesitated for a moment. Then, with a resolve he barely felt, he tapped the door. A few moments later, the door opened, revealing Claire, her eyes widening in shock when she saw him. She looked different, older, more grounded, but still unmistakably Claire. The sight of her stirred something deep within Ethan, something he thought he had buried a long time ago. "Ethan," she asked, her voice laced with confusion. "What are you doing here?" He hesitated, unsure where to even begin. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you." Claire stepped aside, though her expression remained wary. As he entered the familiar space, memories of their time together rushed back, but Ethan pushed them aside. There was no time for nostalgia. He had a purpose here. Once inside, Claire folded her arms across her chest and gave him a pointed look. "So, what's this about?" "It's been years, Ethan. I didn't expect you to just show up out of nowhere." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. "Claire, I need to know the truth. There's something I found out, something I think you can help me with." He paused, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed to fit the magnitude of what he had to say. She frowned, her guard up. "What are you talking about?" "There's a child," Ethan said, his voice strained. "A baby boy. He has my birthmark, Claire. The same mark that runs in my family. I need to know if he's mine." Were you pregnant when we broke up?" The room fell into a heavy silence. Claire's face went pale, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought she might faint. She gripped the back of a chair for support, her knuckles turning white. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't understand." Ethan's stomach twisted. "What don't I understand, Claire? Just tell me the truth." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I tried to tell you. I tried to reach out to you after we broke up, but you wouldn't talk to me. You wouldn't listen. I found out I was pregnant right after we ended things, and I was terrified. Terrified of your family, of what they'd do if they found out." Ethan stared at her, feeling the ground shift beneath him. You knew? You knew all this time, and you didn't tell me?" Claire wiped at her tears, frustration and sadness warring on her face. "It wasn't that simple, Ethan. I knew how much pressure you were under, with your business and your family's expectations. And when I tried to reach out, you made it clear that you didn't want anything to do with me anymore. So I kept him. I raised him on my own." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "Then why was he taken? Why wasn't he with you?" At this, Claire's face crumbled, and she sank into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know," she sobbed. "I don't know who took him. I've been searching everywhere, trying to find out what happened. I thought I'd lost him forever." The pieces began to click together in Ethan's mind, but the puzzle was still incomplete. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone powerful enough to pull strings, to take a child without leaving a trace. His thoughts drifted to Megan, her recent coldness, the distance that had grown between them. Could it be? Could she have known about the child all along? Back at his penthouse, Ethan's mind was still spinning as he poured himself a drink. The alcohol did little to numb the storm of emotions inside him. Claire's revelation had shaken him to his core, but it was the realization that Megan might be involved that truly terrified him. Ethan pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over Megan's name. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Before he could make the call, however, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Stop looking for answers you don't want, Ethan. Walk away, or you'll regret it. Ethan's blood ran cold as he stared at the screen. His worst fears were being confirmed. Someone was watching him, someone knew exactly what he was uncovering. And that someone was willing to do whatever it took to keep the truth buried. Before he could react, the door to his penthouse opened, and Megan walked in, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. She didn't smile. She didn't say a word. "Why didn't you answer my calls?" she asked, her voice icy, her demeanor unreadable. Ethan stood frozen, the phone still in his hand. "I've been busy," he said, his voice clipped. "I found something out, Megan. Something you need to explain." Megan's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something dangerous. "What are you talking about?" "The child," Ethan said, stepping closer to her, his heart racing. "The child with the birthmark. He's mine, isn't he? And you've known about it this whole time, haven't you?" For a moment, Megan's mask slipped, and Ethan saw the truth flash across her face. It was brief, but it was enough. She had known. She had always known. Ethan felt the walls of his world closing in. His wife, the woman he thought he knew, had been hiding the biggest secret of his life from him. And now that he was close to unraveling it, there was no telling how far she would go to keep it buried. The silence in the penthouse was suffocating. Ethan stood motionless, every muscle tense as he faced Megan. The woman who had once been his partner in life, his confidant, now felt like a stranger. The weight of her betrayal was so heavy, it threatened to crush him. "Answer me," Ethan demanded, his voice low but edged with desperation. "You knew about the child, didn't you? You've known this entire time." Megan's eyes flickered, a flash of something unreadable crossing her face before she composed herself. She took a step forward, but Ethan instinctively recoiled, the betrayal hanging between them like a thick fog. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension grew unbearable. "I did it for us, Ethan," Megan finally said, her voice soft but trembling. "You have to understand, I was trying to protect us." "Protect you?" Ethan blinked, stunned by the audacity of her words. "Protect me?" The disbelief in his voice was palpable. "You stole my child, Megan. You took him from his mother, kept him from me. How could that possibly protect me?" Megan's composure started to crack. She ran a hand through her sleek hair, pacing as her breath quickened. "You don't understand. You weren't there when it happened. You weren't there when she came back into our lives, threatening to destroy everything we've built." "She?" Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Claire? This is about Claire?" Megan stopped, turning to face him. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but there was a hardness in her expression that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "Yes. Claire. She came to me a year ago, Ethan. She came to the house when you were away on business, claiming she had your child. She said she didn't want money, she didn't want to ruin our lives, but that's exactly what she was going to do. She wanted you back, and I couldn't let that happen." Ethan stared at her in stunned silence. His mind reeled as he tried to process her words. Claire had come back a year ago? And Megan had known this whole time? His stomach twisted as he thought of the months of lies, the manipulation. But something didn't add up. "And your solution was to take the child?" "To, what, make him disappear?" Ethan's voice grew sharper, disbelief morphing into anger. "You could have told me, Megan. We could have dealt with it together. But instead, he stopped, choking on his words. "You orchestrated his kidnapping." Megan's face contorted with emotion. "I didn't kidnap him. I was trying to protect us." She paused, her voice cracking. "I didn't know it would go this far. I thought if I kept him hidden, Claire would go away, and we could move on. I didn't want to lose you, Ethan. I couldn't." Ethan shook his head, his anger burning hotter. "You did lose me, Megan. The moment you decided to go behind my back, you lost me. And now I have a son I didn't even know existed. A son you kept from me." Megan's tears finally spilled over, but Ethan couldn't find it in himself to care. His world had been shattered, and it was her doing. He turned away from her, running a hand through his hair as he tried to think, to piece together what came next. But then, as he stared out the window into the city below, something clicked in his mind. This wasn't just about Megan. She wasn't capable of pulling off something so complex on her own. Someone else had to be involved, someone who had the resources, the power, to orchestrate something of this scale. His phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. Ethan glanced at the screen. Another message from the unknown number. "You're getting too close. Leave it alone, Ethan, or the next time we meet, it won't be a warning." He stared at the message, the words sinking in. There was someone else behind this. Someone who had been pulling the strings all along. Megan might have been a part of it, but she wasn't the mastermind. There was a larger game being played, and Ethan had only scratched the surface. Turning back to Megan, he showed her the message. "Who's behind this, Megan?" he asked, his voice colder now, laced with suspicion. "Who's been helping you?" Megan's eyes widened, genuine fear flashing across her face. "Ethan, please. I didn't want to drag you into this. It's bigger than you think." "Who, Megan?" Ethan stepped closer, his patience wearing thin. "I need to know. Now." She swallowed hard, her eyes darting away as though she couldn't bear to face him. It's your father." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He staggered back, shaking his head in disbelief. "No. That's impossible." But Megan's expression told him otherwise. "Your father never wanted you to know about the child," she said, her voice trembling. "He was the one who found out about Claire. He was the one who told me what to do." Ethan's world tilted on its axis. His father, his own flesh and blood, had orchestrated the entire thing? The man who had taught him everything about power, about control, about success. The man who had always been a looming figure in his life, pushing him to achieve more, to be more. Could he really have done something so monstrous? Megan stepped forward, her hands reaching for him, but Ethan backed away. "Ethan, please. Your father was trying to protect the family name. He didn't want a scandal. He said if Claire's child was acknowledged, it would ruin everything. He promised me that if we kept quiet, it would all go away." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, anger and betrayal twisting inside him. He thought he knew the limits of his father's ambition, the lengths to which he would go to protect the family legacy. But this? This was unthinkable. "I can't believe this," Ethan muttered, his voice cracking. "He's my son, Megan. My son. And you and my father tried to erase him." Megan's tears flowed freely now, but Ethan felt no sympathy. The walls felt like they were closing in around him. Everything he had believed in, his marriage, his family, even his business, was built on lies and deceit. And at the center of it all was the child he had never known, the son he had been denied. Without another word, Ethan turned and walked out the door, leaving Megan sobbing in the middle of the room. He couldn't bear to look at her, couldn't bear the thought of being in the same space as the woman who had betrayed him so deeply. His only focus now was on finding his father and confronting him with the truth. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe. Ethan's car sped down the highway, his mind racing faster than the engine. His father's estate loomed ahead, a symbol of power and control. But now, it stood for something far darker. As he pulled into the long driveway, memories of his childhood flashed before his eyes, memories of a father who had always been larger than life, always in control. But now Ethan was about to tear down the facade. He stormed through the front door without knocking, the servants barely registering his presence as he made his way to his father's private study. There, sitting behind the large mahogany desk that had always intimidated him as a child, was his father, William Collins. The patriarch of the Collins Empire. The man who had built everything Ethan had ever known. The man who had destroyed his life. William looked up from his papers, his expression unreadable. "Ethan," he said calmly, as though nothing was out of the ordinary. "What brings you here?" Ethan's blood boiled at his father's composure. How could he sit there so casually, as if he hadn't orchestrated the destruction of his own son's life? "You did this," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with rage. "You knew about Claire's child. You knew he was mine, and you tried to hide it from me." William's eyes flickered with something, perhaps surprise, but it was fleeting. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "I did what was necessary, Ethan." Ethan took a step forward, fists clenched at his sides. "You took my son from me. You let Megan lie to me. You manipulated me into thinking my life was perfect while you buried the truth." His father's calm demeanor never wavered. "Your life was perfect, Ethan. You had everything you ever wanted. Wealth, power, respect. What would acknowledging that child have given you? A scandal? A distraction from your responsibilities? I did what was best for the family." Ethan's hands shook with rage. "You don't get to decide what's best for me, or for my son." William's eyes darkened, and for the first time, his voice hardened. "Everything I've done for this family. For you. You have no idea what it takes to protect what we've built." Ethan's chest tightened. "Protect? You think you've protected me by lying to me? By stealing my child?" William rose from his chair, his towering presence still imposing despite his age. "This isn't about you, Ethan. This is about preserving the Collins name. About protecting the future of our legacy. That child would have destroyed everything we've worked for." Ethan's heart pounded in his ears. He could barely process the words coming from his father's mouth. Everything he had been taught, everything he had believed in, was crumbling before his eyes. "You've lost your way, Father," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You think the Collins name is more important than your own flesh and blood? Than your own family?" William's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand the weight of responsibility yet, Ethan. But you will. One day, when you're in my position, you'll see that sacrifices must be made." Ethan shook his head, disgust washing over him. "No. I'll never be like you." Without waiting for a response, Ethan turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving his father standing in the shadows of the empire he had built, a man consumed by power, and destroyed by his own ambition. Ethan drove through the quiet streets of the city, his mind a storm of rage, sorrow, and disbelief. His father's words echoed in his head, twisted justifications for a lifetime of control and betrayal. Every mile that passed only added weight to the crushing realization that his entire life had been shaped by a web of lies. The child he never knew, the life he could have had, is stolen by the people who were supposed to protect him. He had spent his entire life trying to live up to his father's expectations, building the empire his family had dreamed of. But now, as the weight of everything came crashing down on him, all Ethan wanted to do was burn it all to the ground. His phone buzzed in the passenger seat, but he ignored it. It was probably Megan. The thought of her was too painful to bear. Not just because of the lies, but because deep down, he had once loved her, believed in her. The betrayal was sharper for it. How could he have been so blind? So consumed by his ambition that he hadn't seen the cracks forming in his own life? My son. The thought kept cutting through his mind like a knife. The little boy in the park, the child he didn't even know he had. How could he ever make up for the time he'd lost? How could he ever face Claire again, knowing how deeply he had failed her and their child? Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter as he turned into a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. He needed answers, but more than that, he needed to do something. He couldn't just sit back and watch his life crumble around him. This time, he would take control, not for his father, not for the Collins name, but for his son. Ethan arrived at Claire's house late in the evening. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the small, modest home. He sat in his car for a few moments, trying to gather his thoughts, but there was no way to prepare for what was coming. Everything in his life had led him to this moment. The truth he had fought so hard to avoid was now staring him in the face. He knocked on the door, his heart racing. The sound of footsteps on the other side made his stomach clench with anticipation. When the door opened, Claire stood there, her eyes wide with surprise. She was dressed casually, but her expression was guarded, as though she had been expecting something, just not this. "Ethan," she asked, her voice soft but laced with caution. "What are you doing here?" For a moment, Ethan didn't know how to respond. He hadn't seen her in years, and now, in the dim light of her porch, she looked so different from the woman he remembered. Stronger, but also more vulnerable, like life had shaped her into something harder, more resolute. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "It's about everything." Claire stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly, stepping aside to let him in. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with years of pain and unresolved tension. As Ethan entered the small living room, he felt a surge of emotions, memories of their time together, of the life they had almost shared. They sat across from each other in silence, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them both. Claire was the first to speak, her voice steady but filled with sadness. "You found out, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "About him?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "I did. Claire, I had no idea. I didn't know. I didn't know about our son." Claire's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she didn't let them fall. "I tried to tell you, Ethan. I tried, but you were already gone. Your father made it clear that there was no place for me, or for him, in your life." Ethan's heart clenched. His father always controlling, always manipulating. "Claire, I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I should have." "It's not just about what you should have done," Claire interrupted, her voice shaking now. "It's about what they did to us. To him. Ethan, I raised him alone. I kept him safe, or at least I thought I did. But then they took him. I've been living in fear ever since." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had been so consumed with his own guilt, his own confusion, that he hadn't even considered what Claire must have gone through. "Who took him, Claire? Was it my father?" Claire hesitated, then nodded. "I didn't want to believe it at first, but yes. Your father was behind it. He sent people to intimidate me, to make me disappear. And when that didn't work, they took him." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, anger and helplessness warring within him. "I swear to you, Claire, I didn't know. If I had." "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," Claire said, her voice breaking. "You chose your family, your business, over me. Over him. And now we've lost everything." The words hit Ethan like a sledgehammer. She was right. He had chosen his family's empire, his father's approval, over everything else, over the woman he loved, over the life they could have had together. And in the end, he had lost it all anyway. "I'm going to fix this," Ethan said, his voice fierce with determination. "I'm going to get him back, Claire. I'll do whatever it takes." Claire's eyes softened, but there was still a wall between them, a barrier that years of pain had built. "I don't know if you can, Ethan. I don't know if anyone can." Ethan stood, his mind racing. "I'm not going to let them win. Not this time." The next morning, Ethan found himself pacing in his penthouse, every nerve in his body on edge. He had spent the entire night piecing together a plan, contacting lawyers, private investigators, anyone who could help him track down his son and hold his father accountable. But even with all the resources at his disposal, there was still one major obstacle standing in his way: Megan. He hadn't spoken to her since he stormed out the previous night, but now, as he stared at his phone, he knew there was no avoiding it. He needed to confront her, needed to know just how deep her involvement went, and whether she was willing to help him or continue the charade. Taking a deep breath, Ethan dialed her number. The phone rang several times before Megan finally answered, her voice cold and distant. "What do you want, Ethan?" she asked, not bothering to hide the bitterness in her tone. "We need to talk," he said, trying to keep his own anger in check. "I'm coming over." "I don't think that's a good idea," Megan replied icily. "You made it clear last night how you feel about me." "Megan," Ethan said through gritted teeth, "this isn't about us. It's about my son. Our son. I need answers, and you're going to give them to me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might hang up. But then, she sighed heavily. "Fine. Come over. But don't expect anything more than the truth, Ethan. You're not going to like what you hear. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe." Megan's house was eerily quiet when Ethan arrived. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the driveway as he approached the front door. He knocked, and after a moment, Megan opened it, her face set in a hard expression. She stepped aside to let him in, closing the door behind him with a sharp click. They stood in the foyer for a moment, the tension between them thick and palpable. Megan crossed her arms over her chest, watching him with guarded eyes. "What do you want to know?" she asked, her voice clipped. "I want to know everything," Ethan replied, his gaze unwavering. "I want to know how long you've been lying to me. How long you've known about my son. And why." Megan's lips pressed into a thin line. "I already told you last night. Your father was behind everything. He didn't want a scandal. He didn't want Claire to ruin your career, your reputation." Ethan's fists clenched. "And you just went along with it? You lied to me, Megan. You kept my own child from me. How could you do that?" "Because I was trying to protect you." Megan snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. "I did what I thought was best for us, Ethan. For our marriage." Ethan shook his head, disbelief washing over him. "Our marriage? Megan, there is no us anymore. There hasn't been for a long time. You knew that. You knew things were falling apart, and instead of being honest with me, you decided to manipulate me, to lie to me. You destroyed any chance we had." Megan's face crumpled for a moment, and Ethan could see the pain behind her anger. But he couldn't afford to care anymore. Too much had been lost already. "You say you did it to protect me," Ethan continued, his voice rising. "But what about my son? What about the little boy who was stolen from his mother? Who's been hidden away from his own father? You didn't protect him, Megan. You destroyed his life before it even started." Megan's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She stood tall, her voice trembling with defiance. "You were never there, Ethan. You were too consumed with your business, your ambition, to care about anything else. I did what I thought was right. I made a choice, and I'm sorry if it wasn't the one you would have made, but I did what I had to do." Ethan's heart ached, but his resolve was firm. "It doesn't matter anymore, Megan. It's over. I'm going to find him. I'm going to bring him home. And once I do, I'm going to make sure that everyone who had a hand in this pays for what they've done." Megan stared at him, her tears finally spilling over. "Ethan, I didn't mean for things to turn out like this. But it was too late." Ethan turned and walked out the door, leaving Megan behind, her sobs echoing in the empty hallway. That night, Ethan stood on the balcony of his penthouse, staring out over the city that had once felt like his kingdom. Now, it felt like a prison. Everything he had built, everything he had achieved, it all seemed so meaningless in the face of what he had lost. He thought of his son, the little boy with the birthmark that mirrored his own. Somewhere out there, his child was waiting for him, waiting for a father who had failed him before he even knew he existed. But no more. Ethan had made mistakes, yes, but he wasn't going to make any more. He wasn't going to let his father, or anyone else, control his life any longer. It was time to fight. Time to take back what was his. Time to be the man he should have been all along. And he would do whatever it took to make that happen. The weight of everything pressed down on Ethan as he stood at the threshold of his father's estate once more. The familiar sight of the towering mansion no longer filled him with pride or a sense of belonging. Now, it was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, a monument to lies, control, and betrayal. Tonight would be different. Tonight, he was not the obedient son, not the heir to the Collins empire. Tonight, he was a father reclaiming what had been stolen from him. He pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside. The opulence of the grand foyer, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, felt cold and hollow. It had been his world once, but now it seemed as foreign to him as the person he had been only days ago. As he made his way down the hallway toward his father's study, his footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, but his mind was focused, his resolve unwavering. When he entered the study, William Collins was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, as if he had been expecting Ethan all along. His father's face was as stern and composed as ever, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, an acknowledgement that this confrontation had been inevitable. "Ethan," William said, his voice calm but commanding. "I assume you're here to talk about the boy." Ethan's chest tightened at the mention of his son. The boy. His father couldn't even bring himself to say your son. But Ethan was done dancing around the truth. He was done with the Collins way of doing things. "I'm not here to talk," Ethan said, his voice low but full of conviction. "I'm here to make things right." William raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Make things right? You don't seem to understand what that means in this family, Ethan. What I did to protect you, to protect our legacy. Everything I've done has been for you, for your future." Ethan shook his head, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You didn't do it for me, Dad. You did it for yourself. For control. You've spent your whole life controlling everything and everyone around you, and you're so blinded by your own ambition that you can't see the damage you've caused." His father's expression darkened. "Damage? What are you talking about? You have everything. Wealth, power, influence. I had nothing." Ethan shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "You took everything that mattered from me. You kept my son from me, and you manipulated everyone around me to maintain your precious empire. But that's over now." William's eyes narrowed, his voice growing colder. "I taught you everything you know, Ethan. I made you the man you are today. Without me, you would be nothing. You're here because of the decisions I made, because of the sacrifices I made to protect this family." Ethan stepped closer to the desk, his heart pounding in his chest. "You think you've protected me? You've destroyed me. You took away my son's chance at a normal life. You robbed me of years with him that I can never get back. All for the sake of the Collins name." There was a long, heavy silence. William stared at his son, the lines in his face hardening, but for the first time, there was a flicker of something like doubt in his eyes. He had never expected this from Ethan, the son who had always followed the rules, always done what was expected of him. "Your son," William said slowly, "was a complication. Claire was a complication. They would have been the end of you. If you had stayed with her, you wouldn't have the life you have now." Ethan felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "The life I have now is nothing compared to what I lost. I lost a family, Dad. I lost the chance to be a father. And for what? Money? Power? None of that means anything anymore." William's face remained stoic, but there was a flash of something in his eyes, perhaps realization, perhaps regret. He stood up from behind the desk, walking around to face Ethan directly. "You think you can just walk away from all of this?" William asked, his voice hard but quieter now. "You think you can throw away everything we've built because you want to play house with some child you didn't even know existed until last week?" Ethan met his father's gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm not walking away from anything. I'm taking back what's mine. I'm taking back control of my life. You can keep your empire, keep your legacy, but I'm done living under your shadow." William studied his son for a long moment, and for the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only cold calculation. "If you do this, Ethan," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you'll be cut off. You'll lose everything. The business, the fortune, the name, it'll all be gone." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his resolve remained firm. "Then so be it. I'd rather lose everything than live another day in a prison of your making." The words hung in the air between them, and Ethan knew that this was the moment. This was the final breaking point, the moment he had feared and longed for in equal measure. He had spent his entire life trying to live up to his father's expectations, but now, for the first time, he was choosing his own path, no matter the cost. William's expression hardened, and he took a step back. "You're making a mistake, Ethan. You're throwing your life away for nothing." Ethan shook his head. "No. I'm fighting for everything that matters." Without another word, Ethan turned and walked out of the study, leaving his father standing alone in the shadows of the empire he had built, an empire that had cost him his family, and now, his son. The drive to Claire's house was quiet, but Ethan's mind was anything but. His heart was still racing from the confrontation with his father, but for the first time in what felt like years, there was a strange sense of peace settling over him. He had finally stood up to the man who had controlled every aspect of his life. He had finally taken control, not just of his future, but of who he was. When he pulled up to Claire's house, he saw her standing in the doorway, waiting for him. She looked anxious, her arms crossed over her chest, but when their eyes met, there was a softness there, a glimmer of hope. He stepped out of the car and approached her, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached her, they stood in silence for a moment, neither of them knowing quite what to say. Finally, Claire spoke. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. "It's over." Claire exhaled, a mix of relief and uncertainty crossing her face. "And what now? What happens now?" Ethan looked into her eyes, the weight of everything they had been through heavy between them. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't have all the answers. But I do know one thing. I'm not going to lose him, Claire. I'm not going to lose our son." Claire's eyes softened, and she nodded, but there was still a hesitation there, a fear that too much damage had already been done. "And us?" she asked quietly. "What about us, Ethan?" Ethan's heart clenched. He had been so focused on finding his son, on confronting his father, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about what it meant for him and Claire. There was so much history between them, so much pain. But standing here, in this moment, he realized that none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the future. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know what happens between us, Claire. But I do know that I want to try. I want to make things right for him, and for us. If you'll let me." Claire looked at him for a long moment, and Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes, the war between hope and fear, between love and the pain of the past. But then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll try." Ethan exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. It wasn't a resolution, not completely, but it was a beginning, a chance to start over, to build something new from the ashes of what had been. As they stood there, side by side, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. For the first time, he wasn't trapped by his past. He wasn't bound by his father's expectations or the weight of the Collins name. He was free to be the man he wanted to be, the father he needed to be. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's life changed in ways he could never have imagined. His father made good on his threat. He was cut off from the family business, from the fortune that had once defined him. But instead of feeling lost, Ethan felt liberated. He had spent his whole life chasing after wealth and power, only to realize that the most important things had been right in front of him all along. He spent his days reconnecting with Claire, learning how to co-parent their son, building a relationship with the boy who had been a stranger to him for so long. It wasn't easy, there were still moments of tension, of doubt, but slowly, they were finding their way. Ethan took a job at a small investment firm, far removed from the high-stakes world he had once inhabited. The pay was modest, the hours long, but for the first time, he found real satisfaction in his work. He was building something new, something that wasn't tainted by his father's control or the weight of the Collins legacy. It was his life, on his terms. One evening, after a long day at work, Ethan came home to find Claire and their son playing in the yard. The boy, his son, ran to him with a wide grin, and Ethan scooped him up into his arms, laughing as the child's small hands clutched at his shirt. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The empire, the power, the wealth, it had all been meaningless. What mattered was here, in his arms, in the quiet moments of joy and love that he had once taken for granted. Ethan had lost so much, but in the process, he had found something far more valuable. He had found himself. And for the first time in his life, he was truly free. Ethan's journey is one of profound emotional growth. Throughout the story, he is forced to confront the destructive legacy of his family, the lies that have shaped his life, and the betrayals of those closest to him. But through these trials, Ethan emerges as a changed man, one who understands the true value of family, of love, and of living authentically. In the end, he loses the wealth and power that once defined him, but in doing so, he gains something far more important, a sense of purpose, of belonging, and of self. His transformation is not about winning back the empire he once controlled, but about finding peace in the life he now chooses for himself. The audience is left with a sense of emotional satisfaction, knowing that Ethan has not only reclaimed his son and his life, but has also reclaimed his soul. He may not have won in the traditional sense, but he has found a victory far greater than any financial empire could offer. We hope this story moved you as much as it moved us. If you felt the emotional journey of Ethan's transformation, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, tell us what part hit you the hardest, or what you'd do in his shoes. Your feedback means the world to us. And don't forget, subscribe to our channel to stay tuned for more heart-pounding stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next emotional roller coaster that's just one click away. Watch the next story on your screen now, you won't want to miss it.